everybody, and welcome back to Beware the Artist. I am Jeremy Jersa, and this week on the show we have Adam Amram. So, Adam, want to tell everybody who you are and what is it that you do?
What's up, Jeremy? It's really awesome to be here. I'm a painter, drawer, mostly painting. But yeah, I'm an artist right now living and working in Palo Alto, California. Um, Moved out here last August from Philadelphia. So first time living and working on the West Coast, which has been really nice. Um, but yeah, it's great to be here. I'm excited to talk to you.
What would you say are kind of some big differences that you're finding, going from such an East Coast world to moving out there to the West Coast?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like people warn me about the light being really attractive here and really
Mm.
beautiful and very alluring, and I can attest to that. I think it has to do with the way the sun rises and sets, and yeah, everything. Maybe it's just like seeing this side of the world with new eyes, but it's really beautiful out here. With the pandemic and COVID life, it's kind of been hard to articulate what's different and the surreal aspects of living out here compared to just the change in my lifestyle. Um, I would say mostly also I've just been taken by the vegetation out here, like the tropical. I mean, in Philly, there's some beautiful trees and beautiful vegetation to take in, but I feel like I've been a city kid for a couple of years now, coming from Baltimore and then Philly and then over to Palo Alto, the Silicon Valley. It's a very different terrain.
Yeah, I
Um,
can I can imagine. So what exactly is your kind of background in terms of where are you from, where you went to school? You want to elaborate on that for those of our viewers that don't really know you?
For sure. Yeah, so I was born in Israel, Haifa, Israel, and moved when I was 3 and some change to Georgia. I grew up in Georgia and went to school in Baltimore, Maryland, went to Micah. It's where we met one another first. So my undergrad, yeah, I was at Micah, and then I graduated and went to Philly to kind of start up a new practice in a new city. Uh, had plans when I was in Baltimore to kind of stay behind. The gallery scene there was really exciting and a lot of DIY spaces. So I thought maybe I'd stay behind with some friends there. But a group of my friends were excited to kind of make a trek up to New York, but we were halfway committed and decided to settle in Philly, which was a really amazing decision. And then just kind of started planting roots in Philly and worked there as an art handler, had a bunch of different studios, and then came to Palo Alto last August for an opportunity just supporting my partner who's in grad school. So that's why I ended up here. But
Amazing. Um, so the Philly art scene in general, I feel like you don't really understand it unless you're kind of in it. It's so accepting and just so vast at the same time. It it really supports the artists in the city. Could you speak to that a little bit?
for sure. Well, I'll backtrack before I get into the beauty of Philly's art scene. I'll say that what I loved about Philly's art scene is that it mirrored some of the stuff that I was excited that was happening in Baltimore, which
Hmm.
was um, there was gallery openings and nights to go see art as a city.
Mm.
I think every maybe second Thursdays or first Fridays. I'm kind of conflating the two now that I've lived in both places and experienced them. But Philly had the same thing started happening at Vox Populi, and it didn't start happening. It was just I started becoming aware of it when I moved
Right.
there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really liked basically Vox Populi. It would have these. Was it first Fridays or second Thursdays?
First Fridays.
First Fridays, and
Yeah.
then second Thursdays would be on the opposite end of town at the Crane Arts Building,
Hmm.
kind of Kensington, Northern Liberties area. Um, but yeah, it felt like as long as there's a place where there's constant shows happening and constant openings, then that means that it felt for me the dialogue was just it was a perpetual dialogue that
Hmm.
artists were having with each other, getting to see work in person, getting to see each other in person,
Right.
just kind of that celebratory nature that fuels art practice.
Now, this question might kind of fall on deaf ears just because of COVID. But do you see any kind of relation to that out on the West Coast? I know things are very isolated. Have you had much of a chance to kind of settle into the art scene out there?
I will say the deaf ears are true. I'm just kidding. No, it's been really nice to be out here. I would say that unlike Philadelphia and Baltimore, being on the West Coast, and I'm in Palo Alto, so about 45 minutes out to an hour out of SF. Um, I would say that the myth about having a car on the West Coast is definitely rings true for me. I'm like a bicyclist, so
Mhm.
I've been it's been a challenge to kind of navigate to and from things without having to plan a day trip around it. That being said, in spite of the pandemic, the DeYoung Art Museum did this really amazing um, had this really amazing program called the DeYoung Open, which for the first time in I think ever in their institution they had it was their 125th anniversary, and they like did a pitch for an open call to Bay Area artists and had a huge show right when COVID was kind of decompressing and
Mhm.
before the second wave. So I got to experience one community-based opening that was massive and like in a museum institution. So it felt like finally another side to that kind of, that thing I've been wanting of going to an opening and going to celebrate people on this side of
Yeah.
the world. Yeah. But
Yeah.
I would say it's a challenge just to kind of like navigate. It's not like you can go by foot, I feel like, where we have in Philly and Baltimore, but
Yeah, so leading from the kind of openings and that kind of art experience, I want to hop into your practice. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of going through what kind of themes are you really exploring in your work?
sure, yeah. Well, so I said I'm a painter, but primarily I begin most of my work through drawing. It's kind of this sort of taking in these ideas and experiences that I feel and see in the real world day to day, kind of note taking them through drawing and through compositional scribbles. And then I refine that back at the studio with ideas that are more narrative based. So I guess ideas in my work would be, exploring the harmony and dissonance between humanity and between nature, things that kind of mirror each other, mirror existence. But really, I guess past past the human experience would be the sort of the principles of like design and visuals, seeing past a narrative and seeing into. I guess it's hard to articulate this, but sensory experiences that in their own way communicate narratives. So
Mm.
I guess in my work you see a lot of vague depictions of nature and of in people experiencing that nature, and it's hard to give extra words to that, but and I guess that's why I'm a painter. But I would say, yeah, kind of trying to communicate sensory experiences that each of us may experience and may see,
Mhm.
but sit latent within us until we arrive at like looking at a painting or looking at a drawing, and then those feelings kind of come about in the mind. So I guess I look at painting as an inhabitable landscape for the subconscious to see, looking at an image and letting the mind kind of unravel. Um,
So how are you actually kind of starting these pieces? You mentioned a little bit before that you start with kind of the drawing. At what point from there does it start to develop into an actual painting?
for sure. So I keep a pretty intense sketchbook practice. Basically, yeah, I start with the drawing. It starts with going out maybe for a walk or taking in ideas, just listening to music, watching movies, reading books, and then I'll make a note in the sketchbook. And as I start my studio day, or just when I'm back at home, I'll be sketching and thinking on those notes. And then I'll have a series of drawings that I'll take to the studio that I kind of staple to the wall near the paintings. And
Mhm.
then I think I begin the painting just um, I say copy apprehensively because I try to copy the drawing, but it's that transition from a sketch to the painting where everything gets awkward. And yeah, and then it's about just kind of dismantling that awkward, um, what's it called? Lost in translation energy, where
Yeah.
things you're trying to revitalize that sketch and keep its like vitality when you move it to the painting, and that all dies. So you have to reconstruct it. And I think that's where the paintings start.
So one thing that I really love about some of your work is that it can become almost impasto at points, and you have this very thick kind of layering of paint that almost becomes kind of sculptural in the smooth, but still very smoothness of the forms. And then there are flatter areas within the painting. Can you talk to that process?
For sure. Yeah, I guess speaking to the materiality of the paint, began um, I began making paints from pigments about, I would say, 6 years ago. Started this process, and I think it was a teacher point me in the direction of Guerra Paint and Pigments in New York. It's like an amazing pigment shop, and all these like solutions to mix with acrylic binders or oil binders. So what I do is I've kind of amassed this collection of raw pigments, and I'll mix those into a binder, usually acrylic, I mean, usually oil, but actually this past year I started working in acrylics just because I was working inside of the home for first half of this life. But yeah, so I work in raw pigments. That kind of gives the paint a body and this kind of gritty texture.
Hmm.
And as you start to incorporate the binder, you can decide how thick or how viscous you want the paint to be. But I'm glad that you've kind of been able to see that through the paintings, because it's hard when you kind of put a work online that sort of rostering of the image, making it all flat. It's hard to see those details. But yeah, I'm when I'm working, I guess maybe you can relate to this. Like I have a direct um, experience with the surface, and I'm always studying the surface and trying to let it articulate to me what next to do. Um, and so, yeah, that movement between lumpy or curvy or flattened forms or shiny or matte, that all I think is those are the transitions from one idea to the next within the work. And I really love that that gets communicated. And so I'll that by saying, um, I'm always more excited when someone responds well to the work online, because for me that alleviates that stress of that work not being as satisfying in person, because I feel like
Yeah.
the work are much more rewarding in person, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine. I wonder how hard it is to actually kind of photograph that work, but you translate it really well. And I can imagine that that is a frustration for you. But at the same time, like me being a painter as well, I can see and I notice those little painter jokes, those little moments inside the painting. And I think that's one thing that really excites me about the work. How about you? Do you have that same experience when you say you're at a gallery and you like, you can tell how they applied the paint in that kind of painterly way that maybe the average viewer won't see, but you're like, I got that. I see you.
For
Um,
sure, for sure. I feel like that's yeah, it's a funny way to put it. I totally that resonates with me. I feel like I wonder if other artists would agree to this, but I think um, a lot of the language within art is artists talking to other artists. It's
mm,
like there's a certain there's like a certain coding that's embedded with artwork that really could maybe hit or miss on a viewer to the untrained eye. But I guess when you maintain an art practice, you are going through the mechanisms of building an artwork from scratch, and you kind of see small gestures and can trail them back to their origin, or trail them back to like an influence, or see a nod towards. It's like an unspoken thing, but that kind of evokes humor, I think, as like art viewers. We're like, ah, that laugh that you spoke about is like recognizing that and knowing that there's a select few people in the room with you that kind of internalize that little secret. But those are the things that kind of, that's what I love seeing about art in person. And those are things I
mhm,
think you kind of miss sometimes online, unless you really practice viewing online, which I think
yeah.
all of us are a little bit doing right now. But
Yeah, I feel like with the pandemic, all of us have kind of lost that in-person experience, and we're really understanding how much we've taken that for granted. But going back to your studio process, so as you're working, what is the atmosphere in your studio? Do you have music playing? Do you have snacks? Do you have I don't know, incense burning? What's what's the vibe?
That's so funny. I feel like I was just checking off yeses as you were like going. I've definitely done the incense. I've definitely done the snacks. Uh, Maybe I would say, well, I have. It's funny. I have like this Palo Santo here. That's just. I think there's a fun way. Like when I get to the studio, I like to. There's a ritual component to it. So like the changing into the studio garments, the organizing the lunch or the backpack, the reviewing sketchbook, the notes. I have a calendar up at the beginning, at the entry of my studio that I just situate myself when I come to the studio.
Mhm.
And sometimes that means um, lighting an incense. That's not a huge part. I don't want people to walk away with being like, I'm gonna have to light an incense to start painting. But I think, yeah, just creating that ambiance that kind of gets me going and gets me energized to start making without pause. So a lot of the times I kind of isolate snacks to after lunch, just so I'm not like ravenous. Because I've definitely had it where I've just eaten all of my snacks looking at a painting anxiously, trying to make a
Mm.
decision. But I usually go to music first. And yeah, I just been listening to a bunch of albums on repeat. I don't know if that happens to you. But yeah, so music's going. Sometimes I do podcasts. I have a lot of podcasts that I really like. It just depends where I'm at with the work. Um, yeah, if you have to carry out something that you know how to carry out in a painting, podcasts are great.
Mhm.
But if I'm doing something that requires like analysis while I'm making it, I can't really have anything but music. And sometimes
Right.
that's where the music stops playing and I don't realize for like an hour, oh, I have to put something on. Um, I don't know if that, yeah, does that
Yeah,
answer?
I've done that a couple times, not realize get so lost in the painting that the music has stopped and you're like, "Oh,
Yeah,
oh, okay."
that's a good
Um,
sign usually. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I forget who said this quote, but it was saying how you start painting in the studio and you have this audience with you, you have all these voices, and then as you start to paint, as you get into the mode of working, they all start to leave, and then eventually, if you're lucky, you even leave.
yeah.
And so that's kind of a thing that I try to keep in mind during my kind of studio practice. But what albums are you listening to on repeat?
Yeah, that's a good question. I First of all, I love that quote. I think that's Gustin. I'm not sure, but I've
Oh,
heard
is
that.
it? Yeah.
I think so, and I love that. I love that idea because yeah, that's like that's the most pure way I think of working. But what am I listening to right now? I've been listening to a lot of Arthur Russell, which is he's a beautiful musician,
Hmm.
beautiful songwriting and lyrics. But I've been listening to this album "Show Some Emotion" by uh, Joan Armand Trading. I always like butcher her last name, but it's so good. It's like very energizing and it's also very like lovely and kind of tender. So listening to that, um, I yeah, it really ranges. Listening to some Bill Callahan,
Mm.
a lot of different music. Really, I think I try to mimic the energy I'm going out. Like if it's contemplative, like the work that I'm working on, and I'm not necessarily sure what's happening, I try to listen to something that is very instrumental. So I'm not suspended in other stories or narratives because I feel very impressionable and I love music for that in the sense
Mhm.
that it forces me to consider little ideas and little stories and I kind of swallow that up like a sponge and take it in, filter it and put it back into the work a lot of the times. But that's really dangerous for me when I'm not sure what I'm doing with my work because it'll send me in just a terrible tunnel, and I'm just like, what was that? But yeah, I don't know if that answered it, but I would say if people have to walk away with one album to go check out, I would say "Show Some Emotion." I really love that one.
Nice,
I don't
nice.
on tripping. Yeah,
So you started to hint on it a little bit, but I feel narrative is something that is pretty important within your work. But at the same time, you do leave these scenes that you're creating very open. Can you speak to that relationship a little bit?
for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think when you're, well, I'll speak for myself. When I'm painting, and I do have a narrative in mind. For example, I'll have a series of ideas that I want to connect, and I'll use the painting as uh, a sort of body to tether all these ideas together. And I think through that practice, there's not a really cohesive narrative, and that lack of cohesiveness enables a viewer to kind of maneuver around certain ideas within a painting. I think it can become a little bit dull when you can't, or maybe when you can see the entire narrative from start to finish, looking right
Mhm.
at a painting. Um, but yeah, so I leave it open ended to allow for some navigation. But yeah, it begins with taking in these kind of sensory experiences from the world and trying to communicate. Um, Not really trying to communicate much actually, but trying to elicit a
Mhm.
feeling. So yeah, not saying here's what you need to get out from this, but here's how I felt, and maybe that feeling is also is translates from the painting through me through to the painting to you and then back. It's kind of like a bouncing board. But
Yeah.
I'll say this. There's one quote that I love from a contemporary artist, Tal R, who I really admire. And went to a lecture in Philly that he was at, and he said that painting is like a good painting is like a book that is just like when you approach the painting, and I'm paraphrasing, the book is open, and all the pages are like viewable at once. You're not turning any pages. The whole story is just open for you. And you have to maneuver from the beginning to the end. You have to do all that work yourself. And doing that work yourself, you kind of arrive at the story that you've put together, not necessarily that the author's kind of. And I bet that's not even what he said entirely, but that's kind of what I took from it. And it's like a good idea from, that's how I think about painting and narrative within painting.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant metaphor for how to actually enter
Sure.
really any, not just a painting, but any work of art in general. I love that visual.
Yeah.
Um, and building on this idea of visuals and things that kind of push narrative in your work, there's always a kind of skewing of perspective in a certain way. Can you speak to how you're using perspective in the works?
For sure. Yeah. I I I'm looking at perspective mostly as a way to enter into those kind of stories, into those narratives. I think the reason there's like a skewed perspective a lot of the times it comes from my influences of the pictorial image in the world. So whether it's digitized imagery, just like the widescreen of films, the elongation of comic strips,
Hmm.
um, the kind of typography, how typography sometimes follows form, and take elements of that and try to render those ideas into the forms within my paintings. And a lot of times speaking about that backboard of um, communicating something and having it reverberate within the painting. So if a figure is standing near an elongated tree, sometimes I'll elongate the figure's torso and legs to communicate this likeness between the figure and maybe the form of nature. So there's this like connectivity between the two. So stuff like that, I'm always thinking about. And yeah,
And you said in the beginning that you are, mainly a painter, but you've also created many sculptures. Um, and your sculptures are, they feel as though they are extensions from the paintings. You could take one of these figures out of your painting and you're seeing it in three-dimensional forms, and you're still capitalizing on that skewing almost at certain points. Could you speak a little bit to your sculptural process?
yeah, for sure. I got into I do dabble in sculpture. I feel like it's, how would I say, it's like the supplementary to my, I feel like sculptors would not like that. It's not I'm not categorizing it as a lesser of my mediums. It's just what I'm less comfortable working in.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I do it less. And so, but yeah, I found I kind of approach art making the same way I've approached these sculptures. If there seems like there's an opportunity at hand, I kind of try to take advantage of it. And what happened was when I was in Philly, I was at this. Um, they have these Amber Street studios. I forget what they're called. Do you remember those studios in? I think they're in Port Richmond neighborhood. Um, oh, the Loom. The
oh, the
Loom.
loom, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I had a studio. That was my first studio in Philly. It was, I don't know, I got myself into a crazy mess just renting a massive studio in Philly and had it for half a year while I could keep up with the rent.
Yeah.
But one day I was leaving the freight elevator and there were these massive blocks of balsa foam
Mm.
that were just covered in like filthy dust. And there was a tape sticker that said like throw, like I guess throw away. I've never really decided if there was totally garbage or if someone just wrote throw on it, but I didn't take them right away. I just kind of kept watching them like a vulture. And
Mhm.
then after 2 weeks, I was like, I'm going to bring these to my studio. I think what happened was there was a fabricator who left the studio building because people just interchanged in those buildings.
Yeah, yeah.
And so someone just left those aside. And I didn't know what they were going to do, how archival they were, but I brought them to the studio. They're very light. And I think they're about 5 by 5 feet blocks of balsa foam, which I try to figure out how to order some, and they're just way out of my budget that
Yeah.
size. So I was like, I'll just make work with these. Um, and I started carving that foam into forms that were in my drawings at the time. Um, but I think it was, yeah, through it was exactly what you said, trying to maybe this kind of like trying to copy the drawing or trying to render the sketch into a painting or vice versa. Like
Mhm.
it was that for me with sculpture. And for those particular pieces, I started thinking back to these sculptures that I really loved in Baltimore by Franz West. I don't know, is that who? I don't
Yeah.
ever know if it's Vest or West, but Franz
Oh,
West.
that's a good question.
We'll just, I guess we both know who we're talking about. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
most people will. But he's got these beautiful works in the contemporary wing
Mhm.
that kind of invite the viewers to interact with them, sit on them, touch them. And for me, that was radical in a way, like in an institution, touching and kind of caressing work. And I wanted that for the sculptures myself. So I put wheels on them. I matched the pigments for the Franz West pieces and attributed it to those to the two forms that I was building. And then I think they kind of just sat as works of their own that started feeling like figures watching me in my studio. And yeah, I don't know, but for me, as just taking advantage of medium and playing around with form. And I hope that answers the question, but I feel like I just went around in circles. But
No, I think you capitalized on the question very well.
very
Yeah,
cool.
it's interesting. Franz West or West.
Yeah.
I went and saw a exhibition of his at the Tate in 2019, I think, in London, and it was interesting to see the just trajectory of his work because it didn't necessarily start with those kind of large, almost amoebic kind of intestinal type structures. There was a lot of found objects, and I just found that to be really interesting. But that's a weird side note. Um,
No, I like that. I think that that's a lot of what I loved about those, like that kind of amoebic, as a good word for that. I I I, I think I gravitated those not only for their abilities to let people touch them and interact with them, but these kind of lifelike organ-like forms
mm,
that I try to play around with in my work. This like physiological, like kind of referencing the nature of our mushy, membraney tissue type insides.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, for me there's like a mysterious element to that. Like I was just gonna say, like I've been, the reason I love that, and I think I failed to answer this in the initial question about themes, is it kind of speaks to this ability for consciousness that we all have and we all possess to kind of come from like tissue, from nothing,
mm,
like, and it's so mysterious. And I think that's a metaphor that I feel like I'll always be um, picking away at, trying to figure out how that relates and how to communicate that.
Right, right. That also kind of brings up the idea of just texture in general.
For
Um,
sure.
and I feel as though the sculptures as well as the paintings, they have a very seductive texture. You want to touch them, particularly the thicker parts of the paintings, and then moving into the sculptures, they feel very slick, very polished. They're
Yeah.
catching light in a way that's just jewel-like in a certain sense. Was that intentional, or was that just a part of the material itself with those sculptures?
I wish I could say it's totally intentional, but I think that's half intentional and half a byproduct of um, intuition leading me into the right direction. I
Mhm,
think sometimes we pick these mediums, or I pick these mediums for I'm attracted to them, and I think hoping some of that attraction escapes just the studio and kind of um, translates to the viewer. But I think what the reason I gravitate to seductive materials, and most artists do, I think it's this idea that you want to invite people into the work in some way. And
mhm,
it's you want I think people and audiences, and I'm talking from my own experience, I respond to work that kind of calls me in whatever sort of it has this alluring factor, or even if it's really quiet, um, something about it drags me to it and directs me to it. And I think um, something I see in life, or I've noticed in life, is that light in as as a thing that makes other things legible. The way something is lit or the way it's cast in light really draws me to it. I'll like ride my bike places or take walks places or just on drives, and I'll gravitate towards looking at something, and I'll realize that it's under these specific circumstances, this cast of light from this direction, shooting a shadow along a different surface that's textured. All these like little components coming together I realize, wow, that's like why I responded to that. And how can I steal these things from life and put them in the work? I think that's some of the most exciting parts of realizing that you don't need much outside of just the regular mundane, you
mhm.
know, to excite you into art practice, I feel like. So I don't know, that goes back to light. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're also bringing up the ideas of kind of interactional scale in a certain sense,
Mhm.
which leads me to my next question of how are you bringing scale into the work?
It's a good question. I a lot of the times it's not necessarily for me. I usually work mid-range, mid-sized. I
Hmm.
would say maybe about I can't even put a finger on it because I don't haven't really usually worked in anything for that long. Basically, I move around from size to size all the time. But I have a clear idea when I want to bring something into the realm of immersive work, or into the realm of like the space where you can kind of navigate it with your mind, where there's like it's 36 by 36 inches, but it feels expansive and infinite. And I think that a lot of times it's really up to what's within the painting, the perspective within paintings to communicate scale and space. But I've definitely made work where my goal was to immerse the viewer. I have this one painting called Field of Vision, where it's about 130 or so inches, around 140 inches long and 36 inches wide. And it kind of swallows the viewer. And it's all about the gaze and becoming the gaze and leaving the viewer into the space of a subject.
Hmm.
So I'm always thinking of like the potential of paintings to traverse that sort of flattened plane and become immersive spaces. I think that answers it. But yeah, just thinking about how you can manipulate perspective in even the smallest of places in a painting that's 1 foot by 1 foot, even, and it feels like you can travel through it for a long time. That's, I think, an achievement. I think a lot of people try that, myself included.
Yeah, I'm thinking right now specifically about one of your pieces. I think it was I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but
Mhm.
it's a blue room from this kind of snowy static on a screen, and just
Yeah.
that it leads you into a space beyond what it is that you're looking at. And it allows me to kind of retreat into my mind about these kind of almost meditative spaces that are just kind of translating different realms or different dimensions in a certain way. And I think you also capitalize that on your relationship with color. Um, do you want to speak to how you're choosing your palettes or how you are kind of reacting to these different parts of the paintings?
Definitely, yeah. That painting, I believe, was Starry Night, which
Mm,
was from 2019. Um, yeah, I was thinking about. Actually, it's funny that you referenced that one because for me, I was actively thinking about making space in the most flat space. So, like
mm,
the painting, most of the entire space of the painting is consumed by this flattened television screen that's like resting on a static channel. And I was thinking about a lot about duality and trying to convey that duality of this like vibrant, vital energy that's static and incredibly dynamic.
mhm,
But it's just it exists in this like passive state of just kind of always being energized. And that what does that mean to just kind of
right.
be so static but incredibly dynamic? And then referencing, Starry Night through the title to Van Gogh, and that iconic painting where the sky is this celestial, imagined, beautiful space. And I guess, yeah, thinking about how um, colors, form, they all can better describe this duality that everything in life possesses, where there's two or often 10 ways of viewing the same thing.
Mhm.
And I think color and that's how I kind of choose color. I think I'm trying to say, does this feel warm or does it feel cool? Or would it feel better if I intentionally made it cool or intentionally made it warm? So communicating like really um, energizing work with these emotive elements that kind of make it fluid for the narrative, for to direct the viewer into a certain space, certain interpretation. I don't know if that answers it, but it's kind of, yeah,
It
that's how I
does,
pick
yeah.
colors. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think you're doing a great job.
Awesome, awesome.
Um, so you hit on Starry Night, you hit on Philip Guston a little earlier.
Sure.
Who are some of your kind of art heroes or just kind of the biggest influences on your art practice?
That's a good question. Good question because it's a challenging question. I feel like
Yeah.
only because it's depending on the day, I'll probably be excited to say one or two other people. But I think a huge revelation in my trajectory as an artist was discovering the artists out of Chicago, the Harry Who, the Chicago Imagists, and
Mhm,
their predecessors, the Monster Roster, which included amazing artists like Leon Golub, uh, June Leaf, H.C. Westerman. I feel like I could spend my life exploring their work, and I've been doing that. I've been kind of swallowing all the literature that they have on them. But yeah, I would say Ray Oshida from the Chicago Imagists, Roger Brown. I mean, I think a lot of people can see elements within my work and connect them to these artists, and there's a reason for that. I think their work explores color so beautifully and so poetically, and also welcomes this flattened space where um, I think the imagists are attributed as imagists because they're this longing for the pictorial and the flattened um, and the narrative. And so I operate within that space because I look to painting as a place to mm, make poems through images. So
mhm,
rendering images to conjure up metaphorical narratives. Um, this juxtaposed position of imagery and color to kind of build a world and develop a language. And I feel like all those artists that I mentioned have their own specific languages that you don't, maybe it's stylization. And I'm always a little bit
mhm.
worried about getting into uh, pigeonholed by style. But I
Yeah.
think there's something really beautiful about seeing a work and knowing who it's by. There's like a comfort in their language that you've studied a little bit. I don't know, and this coded element of that
Yeah,
void.
yeah. I'd agree with that completely.
Yeah.
So that being said, um, and this is a little bit of an on the spot question.
Sure.
One piece of art that you have to experience in person before you die, anywhere in the world, what is it and why?
Damn, this one's worse than the previous question. Um, yeah, I feel like this one's like actually this one's giving me like sweaty palms and a little
Yeah.
goosebump. Just because like you say if you say something, I feel like it'll live forever. It's really hard because I think one thing I was thinking about if Jeremy asked me this question, what I'm happy prepared, and I don't think there's works that I haven't seen. I'm more inclined to pick a work that I've seen already, just because I know um, more about it. But it's so hard. Maybe I'll just. This is like a weird way to answer this, but maybe I would say I want to see before I die more work by Elizabeth Murray in person.
Okay. Yeah.
I can't put a finger on it. She's got these really beautiful paintings, series of paintings where she describes this coffee mug that's like it's like kind of in a cyclical. It's kind of being poured out and being topped off over and over again. There's this infinity. I don't know what the name of it's called, but I've seen two of her works in person, and I can kind of just sit there and look at them forever. They're so generous. They give a lot of
Yeah.
info back. And as makers, and we talked about this before, seeing these little cues in artworks, uh, they're the paintings that make me want to run to the studio. And I don't even make work in the same realm, but it's this idea of like constructing so sculpturally as a painter that makes me like energized, motivates
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna think on that, and maybe I'll I'll send you an email with a
Sounds
perfect
good.
answer. Okay. Okay.
Um, so as a young emerging artist, we're constantly looking for opportunities and trying to get our work out there, trying to be seen. How do you actually go about finding opportunities within the art world?
Yeah. I try to make space in my week for looking and going to seek out opportunities. And
Hmm.
what that means would be like um what that means would be like making space where I write emails or I'll do some research. I like to use NIFA as a database. It's a really nice database for artists,
Hmm.
NYFAA, and they have a classifieds ad where there's all these artist listings, space listings, opportunities, submissions. Um, I would say I do a healthy amount of research to look for opportunities, grants, and things to submit to. But I also feel like it's a lot of cold calling artists, not galleries, but writing to people whose work you admire, starting a conversation, whether it's even on Instagram,
Hmm.
with people that just, it's like in a genuine way, but also like, just asking questions that are, I think, helpful to you, like whether you want to know if they've worked at this gallery, if they have, how long, how do they like it, who would you recommend that's in my community that I should go befriend or go to see their shows. It's a
Hmm.
little different with the pandemic, but
Yeah.
I think um yeah, just trying to be open to opportunities. I would caution people to over apply to stuff. I wouldn't exhaust yourself because that's so tiring.
I
So
agree.
right? Just like making a healthy schedule of studio practice and maybe one day of the week where you kind of waste time online, looking at
Hmm.
opportunities, considering different things, sending a few emails, and then hide from that process. I wouldn't do that too much, but
Yeah, I feel like a lot of, and I ask this question because I feel a lot of young artists, they get application fatigue, and they then in turn stop making their work because they're just exhausted, and they're constantly applying, and then they turn around and then they're like, "Oh, I haven't made any work in 4 months."
yeah,
So it's that balance, and finding that balance while still seeking out and being actively present in seeking out those opportunities.
absolutely. That was great. Application fatigue, that was a great thing to bring up. I think for sure. I would say two things is that yes, when you have, I guess everybody knows, like when it rains, it pours. Like when you get a rejection or when you get an opportunity, it's like either you're flooded with opportunities that you're kind of stretched thin, or you're bombarded with rejections that just completely demoralize your whole essence and you don't want to
Hmm.
make art. But I think most artists will take comfort knowing that most artists have felt that, and many artists more than others. But I would say, yeah, the best advice on what I do is like trying to communicate artists who I really admire and start up long form conversations
Hmm.
that eventually lead to meeting in person. Um, and I would say every artist that I've met in person, and we've had a good conversation, I'm still in touch with. And yeah, so it's kind of fun. You kind of nurture your own community, even if it
Hmm.
exists online for the time being.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. It kind of leads me to my next question. And this is always a weird one. But at what point in your life did you start calling yourself an artist?
This one's funny because I feel like um, I would say apprehensively in high school, which is so
Mhm.
funny because like nobody feels, I don't think anybody feels super comfortable in high school, but I knew that I knew when everybody was kind of communicating where they were going to study in school, I knew that for me it would have to be an art program. I was just the curriculum in regular school wasn't anything built around the art world, and I just really wanted to understand art history, take courses in art history, and study painting in school and printmaking. And so, in high school, I would say I was excited to say I'm an artist, but as soon as you get to college, you like nobody wants to call themselves an artist because I feel like
Mhm.
that's maybe cliche and cheesy, and your professors certainly don't want to let you be called an artist. They're going to be like, you're a student. And I feel like, and that's a great way to be, I think, in school. But I would say, even now, I feel like I don't know how do you respond to that? Because even now, I say depends on who I'm talking to. I'll have a different response. I'll say I'm a painter. I'm a
Yeah, well, for
mm,
for me, I honestly didn't I didn't really take ownership of the role and the name of being an artist until I was like halfway through grad school.
wow, yeah,
And I was like, yeah, I'm an artist and I'm taking ownership of that. And I was working through a lot of things to kind of more so own my studio practice and kind of stick up for those things that tend to get torn down through grad school. But I think at that point is when I started really kind of owning it and saying, yes, I am an artist, and moving forward with that.
for sure, for sure. Yeah, there's just perfect. It's like a perfect blend of pride and also like the humbling of like one's ego. Like you have to
Yes.
call yourself an artist. You have to situate yourself perfectly in between those two and kind of understand the different ways people are going to internalize what you call yourself.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's fun to ask people that. I always love artists that say they rejected the title artist. I always feel like there's like it's really exciting and brave when people say that. I was just trying to think honestly. I think I claimed the title before I knew what it came with or like
Hmm.
knew it, you know? So it was
Yeah.
like a little bit of naive energy, but it's something that I'm really happy I had the kind of um, desire to chase that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it's oof.
Um, so one thing that I also like to ask every guest on the show, what is one piece of advice that you've received over your career so far that's really kind of impacted you? And what is one piece of advice that you would like to pass on to an up and coming generation of creatives?
Yeah, that's a really good. It's a really good question. Or it's a really good thing to think about. One piece of advice, maybe the piece of advice that I've heard that I really like and I find motivating. I'll just use that for both
Mhm.
answers in the sense. I was listening to an interview with Laurie Anderson, the musician, and I would call Laurie an artist of all disciplines. But she was saying, and I'll paraphrase, but she said that dangerous art can be made with a pencil. So what I gathered from that, I think what she was describing was just to be an artist is this practice of resourcefulness and realizing that with even a very limited amount of resources, you can make a lasting and very impactful statement. Um, that so basically, it just means that art as a language, as a powerful thing, substance is can be accessed and can be utilized with the smallest of means. And I
Mm.
think that is a really good thing to know for yourself and also to share with younger artists or any artist really as a reminder. Just um, you don't need much, but I think it doesn't really necessarily have to operate within material, but it's like a really important idea can be communicated with very small means. And I think one more thing to think about is like this idea of like art practice. Like I guess this would be to younger artists, and I would even categorize myself in that space. But this idea of like um, art art practice is just a constant, this like perpetual state of problem solving. And when you even if you arrive at a solution, those solutions oftentimes evoke more problems. So it's like I feel like that's part of the woes of an art practice is just this kind of like cycle of like highs and lows and like always being dissatisfied has like the
Mm.
plateau and then like seeking satisfaction in these like little moments of connection where you've solved something and then it gets you to this other problem and it drops you back down. So it's just like it's about I guess resilience and the love for problem solving alone, which is a disturbing kind of like realization. But yeah, I would say Laurie Anderson's quote is really for me, yeah, dangerous art can be made with a pencil feels very inspiring.
I think that's brilliant, and I think that's kind of the perfect place to kind of end this. Um, so, if people are looking for your work, where will they be able to find it?
For sure. You can go to my website, adamamram.com, and I'm on Instagram, uh, just Adam underscore Amram underscore. I wasn't thinking about the longevity of that odd username when I made it. But yeah, and if anybody like wants to reach out, like I was advocating to do, feel free to. I usually answer every message that I've ever gotten. Um, but yeah, I think yeah, this was great. I'm really happy you invited me on here. Thanks, I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Adam, thank you so much for being on the show. If you guys are interested in Adam's work, make sure you go check it out, and make sure you tune in next week for our next episode of Beware the Artist. Adam, thank you again for being on the show. This was an absolute pleasure, and I will see you later.
See you later.